Shawnee warriors versus Virginia militia. Blood battle at Point Pleasant. Blood-soaked earth, gunfire piercing through morning fog, and the echoing war cries of native warriors. The Battle of Point Pleasant would become one of the most significant clashes between colonists and Native Americans in 18th century America. Before we follow this dramatic story, make sure to subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories for more fascinating tales of Native American history and colonial conflicts. The roots of this pivotal battle trace back to 1763, when King George I, Privy Council, issued a momentous proclamation that would shake the American frontier. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 drew a bold line along the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding British colonists from settling west of this boundary. This attempt to maintain peace between colonists and Native Americans proved futile almost immediately, as settlers pushed westward, despite the royal decree. Between 1768 and 1771, a series of treaties dramatically reshaped the colonial frontier. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 marked a crucial turning point, as British officials negotiated with the Six-Nation Iroquois Confederacy to extend Virginia's western boundary deep into present-day Kentucky and West Virginia. This was followed by the Treaty of Hard Labor, 1768, and the Treaty of Lochaber, 1770, with the Cherokee, further solidifying British claims to these contested lands. However, a critical voice was missing from these negotiations. The Shawnee, who had long hunted these lands and considered them their ancestral territory, were never consulted. They refused to recognize the authority of the Six Nations to cede their hunting grounds to the British Crown. This fundamental conflict over land rights and sovereignty would have devastating consequences. The situation was further complicated by colonial land interests. Prominent Virginians, including George Washington himself, had significant financial stakes in Western lands. They viewed these territories not just as potential settlements, but as valuable opportunities for land speculation. This economic motivation drove an aggressive push for Western expansion, despite Native American claims to the land. As settlers streamed across the Proclamation Line, tension mounted in the Ohio Valley. This resource-rich region held immense strategic importance for both sides. For the colonists, it represented opportunity and wealth. For the Native Americans, particularly the Shawnee, it was their homeland, hunting grounds that had sustained their people for generations. The scene was set for a confrontation that would change the course of American frontier history. As the settler population pushed westward, the years 1772 to 1774 saw an alarming escalation of violence along the frontier. Beginning in 1772, Shawnee raiding parties intensified their attacks on Western Virginia settlements, particularly targeting communities in Augusta, Beausejour, and Fincastle counties. The situation became so dire that by early 1774, Alexander McKee, Britain's deputy Indian supervisor at Pittsburgh, was compelled to alert his superior, Sir William Johnson, about the growing crisis. The territorial landscape grew even more complicated on January 1, 1774, when a power struggle erupted between Virginia and Pennsylvania over the strategically crucial forks of the Ohio region, where the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers converged to form the Ohio River at Pittsburgh. John Connolly, acting under direct orders from Virginia's Governor Lord Dunmore, boldly proclaimed the Pittsburgh region as part of Virginia's Augusta County. This declaration directly challenged Pennsylvania's prior organization of the same territory as Westmoreland County in 1773. Connolly moved swiftly to establish Virginia's authority, raising a militia and organizing a local court, actions that would have far-reaching consequences for the region's stability. The mounting tensions reached a devastating climax on March 30, 1774, in what would become known as the Yellow Creek Massacre. At Baker's Bottom, a trading post across the Ohio River, from a Native American hunting camp. Brothers Daniel and Jacob Greathouse, along with their followers, perpetrated a brutal attack. They murdered 13 peaceful Mingo Indians in cold blood, an act that would spark a fierce cycle of revenge. Among those who lost family members in the massacre was Ta Jute, a prominent Mingo warrior known to the settlers as Logan. The massacre had claimed the lives of his sister and other relatives, igniting in him an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. Logan, previously known for his friendship with settlers, assembled a force of 40 warriors and launched a series of retaliatory raids against backcountry settlements. His warriors struck with devastating efficiency, destroying farms, killing and scalping settlers, and taking captives. These raids spread terror throughout the frontier communities and marked a point of no return in native-settler relations. The situation demanded a response from colonial authorities. On March 25, 1774, Governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation calling the county militias to arms, anticipating the need to defend against what he perceived as an imminent invasion. His military strategy was comprehensive and forward-thinking. He ordered the construction of new defensive fortifications at key strategic points. Fort Blair, at Point Pleasant, positioned at the crucial confluence of the Great Kanawha and Ohio rivers, and Fort Fincastle, near the mouth of Wheeling Creek. However, Dunmore's strategy went beyond mere defense. By late July 1774, he had developed an ambitious offensive plan. Major Angus MacDonald led 400 militiamen from Frederick, Berkeley, and Hampshire counties across the Ohio River in a show of force. This expedition engaged in several skirmishes and conducted raids against Shawnee villages at Wackatomica on the Muskingum River, though notably sparing the neighboring peaceful Lenape settlements. While the operation achieved tactical success, it failed to achieve its strategic objective of deterring further Shawnee raids. The escalating violence and failed diplomatic efforts led Governor Dunmore to formulate a more aggressive strategy. His plan called for a two-pronged invasion of Shawnee territory, specifically targeting Chillicothe, their principal settlement on the Scioto River. In his own words, the goal was to break the Confederacy and render their plans abortive. This military response would set the stage for one of the most significant battles in colonial frontier history. As tensions reached their breaking point, Governor Lord Dunmore devised an ambitious military strategy that would become one of the largest coordinated operations against Native American forces in colonial history. His plan called for a decisive two-pronged invasion of Shawnee territory, with the primary objective of striking at Chillicothe, the principal Shawnee settlement on the Scioto River. On July 24, 1774, Dunmore set his complex military machine in motion. The Northern Division, consisting of 1,200 men drawn from Berkeley, Frederick, Hampshire, and Dunmore counties, along with the District of Augusta around Pittsburgh, would operate under Colonel Adam Stephen. Dunmore himself would serve as commander-in-chief, accompanying this division. Their numbers were soon bolstered when Major William Crawford led a detachment of 500 men from Redstone to Fort Fincastle, bringing vital supplies, including pack horses and cattle. The Southern Division took shape under the command of Colonel Andrew Lewis, the county lieutenant of Boudinot County. Initially ordered to raise 1,000 men from Augusta, Boudinot, and Fincastle counties, Lewis's force grew even larger as additional volunteers from Bedford and Culpeper counties joined the ranks, eventually reaching 1,300 men. Colonel William Preston, an influential backcountry surveyor, remained behind as county lieutenant of Fincastle County to coordinate the defense of 3 frontier counties. The military preparations were not limited to troop movements. A network of defensive fortifications was established to secure the frontier. New forts were strategically positioned. Fort Blair at Point Pleasant, controlling the crucial confluence of the Great Kanawha and Ohio rivers, and Fort Fincastle, near the mouth of Wheeling Creek. These fortifications served both as defensive strongpoints and as forward supply bases for the planned offensive operations. What the Virginia forces didn't realize was that their every move was being meticulously observed. The Shawnee had deployed an extensive network of head scouts who tracked both armies from the moment they departed their bases. These scouts provided Chief Cornstalk with detailed intelligence about troop movements, numbers, and supply lines. This superior intelligence gathering would prove crucial in the coming battle. By late August, the Northern Division had begun its advance. The main force of 700 men united with Crawford's contingent of 500 at Wheeling on September 30. Prospects for peace briefly flickered when Chief Cornstalk indicated his willingness to negotiate with Governor Dunmore at the mouth of Hockhocking Creek. However, these hopes were quickly dashed by news of fresh raids against settlements along the Monongahela River. The army pushed forward to Hockhocking Creek, where they constructed Fort Gower as a fortified magazine. On October 6, Lewis's arrival at Point Pleasant marked the beginning of a critical phase. His troops established a triangular camp in a strategic position where the Kanawha River joined the Ohio River. The positioning was carefully planned. The Boutetourt Line and two Fincastle companies spread their tents along the Ohio River's banks, while the Augusta County Line established their position along the Kanawha. This formation provided natural barriers on two sides, though it would later prove to have both advantages and disadvantages during the battle. Meanwhile, Chief Cornstalk's network of scouts continued their meticulous surveillance, providing him with detailed reports of both armies' movements. These scouts had tracked both divisions since their departure, giving the Shawnee leader a complete picture of the Colonial forces' positions, strengths, and vulnerabilities. This intelligence would prove crucial in the decisions that followed. On October 9, after careful deliberation, Cornstalk made a bold, strategic decision. Rather than waiting for the two colonial armies to unite, which would have created an overwhelming force of more than 500 men, he chose to strike at Lewis's smaller force first. Under the cover of darkness, he moved his warriors to the abandoned settlement known to the whites as Old Shawnee Town, just 2 miles from the Virginia Militia's camp. The movement was executed with remarkable stealth. Not a single colonial sentry detected the crossing of nearly 500 warriors across the Ohio River on hastily constructed rafts. The Shawnee positioning was masterful. By midnight of October 9, Cornstalk's forces had assembled at Old Shawnee Town in complete silence. Their location provided excellent access to the Virginia camp, while offering multiple retreat routes if needed. Cornstalk's plan was to advance before dawn, eliminate the enemy pickets, and launch a surprise attack while the Virginians slept. After what he hoped would be a decisive victory, he would then lead his warriors to intercept Dunmore's division as it advanced along Hockhocking Creek. The ground between the two forces was challenging terrain, a peninsular strip of land with the Ohio River on one side and the Kanawha on the other. The area was heavily wooded and filled with driftwood and rock outcroppings, features that would significantly influence the coming battle. Additionally, the early October weather had brought a heavy ground fog to the river valley, creating conditions that would play a crucial role in the next day's events. As night fell on October 9, both armies rested in their positions, though with vastly different levels of awareness. The Virginia militia, despite having guards posted, remained largely unaware of the impending threat. Meanwhile, Cornstalk's warriors maintained absolute silence as they made final preparations for their dawn attack, their positions concealed by darkness and the thick forest undergrowth. On the morning of October 10, 1774, heavy fog covered the river valley at Point Pleasant. Cornstalk's warriors, who had crossed the Ohio River during the night, were positioned across a 5-acre field 2 miles from the Colonial camp. The warriors remained motionless and silent in their concealed positions through the early morning hours. Just after sunrise, several Virginia militiamen left their camp to hunt for fresh game to supplement their meat rations. 2 miles from camp, they unexpectedly encountered Shawnee warriors scattered throughout the wooded terrain. In the immediate clash, the Shawnee shot and killed one of the soldiers. The other hunters ran back through the morning mist to raise the alarm in camp. Upon hearing the news, Colonel Lewis dispatched 2 contingents of 150 men each, believing they were facing only a large scouting party. Colonel Charles Lewis led one column while Colonel William Fleming commanded the other. The militiamen advanced into the fog-shrouded forest at approximately 6:30 a.m. Cornstalk, though his original plan for a surprise attack on the sleeping camp had been discovered, quickly adapted. Seeing the militia divided, he ordered his warriors to engage the separated units. The Shawnee launched their attack when the Virginia columns had advanced almost half a mile from camp. The Shawnee concentrated their fire on the front ranks of both advancing columns with devastating effect. Colonel Charles Lewis, wearing his distinctive scarlet officer's coat, was struck early in the engagement. His wound would prove fatal within hours. Colonel Fleming was seriously wounded, but continued to command his men until he could no longer maintain his position. The Eastern militia column began to waver under the intense fire. As they fell back, Cornstalk's warriors pressed forward, maintaining heavy fire while simultaneously targeting the Western column. The sound of continuous gunfire filled the valley as wounded militiamen made their way back to the main camp. 30 minutes into the engagement, the steady stream of gunfire and returning wounded made the situation clear to Colonel Andrew Lewis. His forces faced a major Native American army, not a simple scouting party. The morning fog and gun smoke filled the forest, severely limiting visibility for both sides. The Shawnee warriors, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain, maintained their aggressive assault, while the Virginia militia struggled to form an effective defense against the unexpected attack. On the morning of October 10, 1774, heavy fog blanketed the river valley at Point Pleasant. Nearly 500 Shawnee warriors, having crossed the Ohio River during the night on hastily constructed rafts, lay positioned across a 5-acre field 2 miles from the Colonial camp. Their location, at the abandoned settlement known as Old Shawnee Town, provided them with excellent coverage and multiple approach routes to the Virginia camp. Just after sunrise, several Virginia militiamen from the Fincastle companies ventured out from their triangular camp at the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers. They were searching for deer to supplement their dwindling meat rations. 2 miles from camp, near Old Town Creek, they encountered Shawnee warriors scattered through the dense woodland. The warriors immediately opened fire, killing one of the hunters. The remaining militiamen sprinted back through the fog-covered terrain, raising the alarm as they reached camp. The drummers immediately beat to arms in alarm as men scrambled to retrieve their weapons. Field officers gathered quickly, with Colonel Lewis, to assess the situation. Believing they faced only a large scouting party, Lewis ordered his 2 subordinate colonels to lead the response. He instructed them to detach 150 men each from their respective lines to locate and determine the size of the enemy force. Colonel Charles Lewis led the first column, drawing his men from the Augusta line, while Colonel William Fleming commanded troops from the Boudetour line. Both columns moved out from camp at approximately 6:30 a.m., advancing methodically through the fog-shrouded forest. The troops spread out as they moved, attempting to locate the enemy force. Within minutes of one another, both columns were ambushed. The Shawnee had positioned themselves behind trees, rocks, and fallen logs, creating an effective crossfire. The initial volley was devastating. Colonel Charles Lewis, clearly visible in his scarlet officer's coat, took a fatal shot and managed to make his way back to camp before dying several hours later. Colonel Fleming suffered 3 bullets that penetrated his arm and chest, yet remarkably continued directing his men until he became effectually disabled. The Eastern militia column began to waver under the intense fire. The Shawnee warriors, seizing this advantage, pushed forward aggressively, forcing the militiamen to retreat about 200 yards. Simultaneously, they maintained heavy fire on the western column, creating chaos in both units. Wounded militiamen began streaming back to the main camp, using the early morning fog as cover. At 7 o'clock, approximately 30 minutes into the engagement, Colonel Lewis received reports from his field commanders that made the gravity of the situation clear. He immediately dispatched 200 reinforcements under Colonel John Field. When both colonels fell, 4 surviving captains took command of their units, struggling to maintain order under the constant Shawnee assault. By 9 o'clock, the battle had developed into a full-scale engagement along a mile-long front. Colonel John Field's reinforcements of 200 men had closed the line and halted the Colonial retreat. The militia established a continual line of defense stretching from the Ohio River on their left flank to the Kanawha River on their right. Individual soldiers from the encampment began arriving to fill gaps in the line wherever they appeared. The battlefield terrain heavily influenced the fighting. The river bottomland was filled with driftwood and rock outcroppings, which both sides used for cover. The Shawnee warriors and Virginia militiamen alike found themselves fighting from behind rocks, trees, and stumps, each man essentially fighting his own individual battle in the confined space. Through the heavy fog and thick-hanging gun smoke, the Shawnee pushed forward aggressively. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Rifles and muskets, once fired, became clubs. Warriors and militiamen alike fought with tomahawks, knives, and even bare hands. The sound of fifes calling militia companies to muster was met with mocking war cries from the Shawnee warriors. Chief Cornstalk's commanding presence dominated the battlefield. Taller than his warriors and easily recognizable, he moved constantly along the Shawnee lines, encouraging his men. His powerful voice carried across the din of battle, repeatedly shouting, "Be strong! Be strong!" Virginia militia soldiers tried repeatedly to target the prominent leader, but without success. The battle lines surged back and forth throughout the morning. The warriors, led by their chiefs Red Hawk, Blue Jacket, Black Hoof, and Cornstalk, launched brave frontal rushes against the colonial positions. This unusual tactic for Native American warfare was necessitated by the terrain, with the militia's flanks secured by the rivers. The Shawnee couldn't execute their preferred strategy of flanking maneuvers. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the militia gained control of a long ridge strewn with logs and rocks that offered excellent cover. The Shawnee fell back to a second ridge, stretching from the Ohio River to a swamp. As the morning fog lifted, the shooting became more precise. The militia's long rifles proved superior in accuracy at greater distances, gradually shifting the battle's dynamics. The fierce hand-to-hand combat that had characterized the morning's fighting began to give way to long-range exchanges. The Shawnee maintained their position on the second ridge, while the militia used their newly captured high ground to good effect. Despite being outnumbered at least 2-1, Cornstalk's forces held their ground. The chief had made the unusual decision to stand and fight rather than retreat, knowing that allowing Lewis and Dunmore's forces to unite would leave his people with no chance of victory. The fighting continued hour after hour along the ridgelines, with ammunition running low for both sides. The militia's superior numbers were offset by the Shawnee's advantageous position and tactical skill. From his command position in the late afternoon, Colonel Andrew Lewis surveyed the deadlocked battlefield. He gathered his officers and outlined a bold flanking strategy to break the stalemate. Lewis handpicked 3 companies for the maneuver, selecting troops who still had sufficient ammunition and energy for this crucial assault. The chosen companies began their movement with utmost stealth. They withdrew from the Colonial battle line in small groups to avoid attracting attention. Taking a circular route up the Kanawha River, they used the steep riverbank as cover, staying low and moving slowly to maintain silence. The terrain was challenging. They had to navigate through dense underbrush, and around fallen trees while maintaining their formation. When they reached Crooked Creek, the flanking force turned to follow its course. The creek bed provided natural concealment as they moved into position. They emerged carefully onto a slight ridge, finding themselves perfectly positioned on the left rear of the Shawnee lines. The elevation gave them a clear view of the warrior positions that had been so effectively hidden from the main Colonial force. The Colonial troops on the main line maintained heavy fire to mask the sound of the flanking movement. At this time, Cornstalk's scouts, who had been monitoring all approaches to the battlefield, brought him reports of movement along Crooked Creek. The Shawnee chief, who had been directing the battle from various positions along his line, immediately recognized the threat to his left flank. The flanking force opened fire with devastating effect, their shots coming from an unexpected direction and higher ground. The Shawnee warriors, who had been focusing their attention on the main Colonial line, suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire. The confusion was amplified by reports of Dunmore's approaching column. Many warriors initially believed this new attack was from the Northern Division they had hoped to engage separately. Chief Cornstalk demonstrated his tactical brilliance in the face of this new threat. Rather than allowing his forces to be caught between two fires, he quickly organized his warriors into three groups. His best marksmen were positioned to maintain steady fire on both the main Colonial line and the flanking force. A second group began preparing positions for a fighting retreat, while the third group established a secure route back to their river crossing points. The Shawnee commander moved constantly among his warriors during this critical phase, his voice carrying over the sound of battle. As he directed the complex withdrawal, his warriors executed a series of coordinated movements, alternating between groups to maintain continuous fire, while gradually pulling back. They used the terrain masterfully, taking advantage of every rock, log, and tree to cover their withdrawal. The Colonial flanking force attempted to press their advantage, moving forward to occupy the positions the warriors were abandoning. However, the Shawnee rear guard's accurate fire kept them from advancing too rapidly. The main Colonial line also began to push forward, but cautiously, wary of any counterattack from the still dangerous Shawnee force. As the afternoon progressed, the Shawnee withdrawal continued with remarkable discipline. Groups of warriors would hold their positions, laying down heavy fire, while others retreated to new positions, then provide covering fire for the next group. This leapfrogging withdrawal allowed them to maintain an effective fighting force until they reached their crossing points on the Ohio River. The setting sun cast long shadows through the forest, as the last shots of the battle echoed across the river valley. The Shawnee had successfully broken contact with the Colonial forces, their disciplined withdrawal preserving both their fighting strength and their warrior tradition of protecting their fallen comrades. Lewis's flanking maneuver had achieved its objective of dislodging the Shawnee from their strong positions, but Cornstalk's skillful tactical response had prevented the complete destruction of his force. The Battle of Point Pleasant exacted a heavy toll on both sides. The Virginia militia suffered 75 killed and 140 wounded, amounting to nearly a quarter of their fighting force. Among the dead was Colonel Charles Lewis, who succumbed to his wounds hours after being shot early in the battle. Colonel William Fleming survived, despite sustaining 3 serious bullet wounds to his arm and chest. When Colonel Christian arrived at the battlefield the morning after the fight, he led his men across the contested ground. They discovered 21 dead Shawnee warriors lying in open terrain, and 12 more hastily covered with brush and old logs. The Shawnee had carried away most of their wounded and committed many of their dead to the river, following their tradition of protecting their fallen from enemies. Among their significant losses was Puxinwa, father of the future Shawnee leader Tecumseh. The Colonial forces recovered substantial military supplies from the battlefield. They collected 40 guns, numerous tomahawks, and various other equipment. This captured materiel was later sold at auction for £74, 4 shillings, and 6 pence. In the immediate aftermath, the Colonial camp at Point Pleasant descended into chaos. Lord Dunmore arrived around midnight to find a desperate situation. The wounded overwhelmed the limited medical resources available. Injured men lay suffering with minimal treatment options, while officers struggled to reorganize their depleted units and maintain defensive positions against possible counterattacks. The tactical situation remained precarious. The Colonial spent several days recovering and reorganizing their forces at Point Pleasant. During this time, they completed a fortified camp that included a hospital and forward supply magazine, which became known as Fort Blair. These defensive works were crucial, as the possibility of a Shawnee counterattack remained very real. On October 14, Colonel Lewis's report of the battle reached Governor Dunmore. The following day, the militia crossed the Ohio River, ready to advance toward the Shawnee towns. Colonel Lewis had received orders to march soon to the Shawnee towns and join him on the way. The Virginia forces moved with purpose, but remained cautious, encountering only light opposition as they advanced. Meanwhile, Dunmore's Northern Division pushed forward from Fort Gower toward Pickaway Plains, near the principal Shawnee towns. Here they established Camp Charlotte, creating a secure base for future operations. Through their Delaware scouts, they learned that Cornstalk still commanded approximately 700 warriors at Chillicothe, plus their families. The Shawnee now faced a critical strategic decision. They could either abandon their towns and retreat, or launch an attack against 1,100 entrenched militiamen at Camp Charlotte, a force that would double in size once Lewis's contingent arrived. The Battle of Point Pleasant had significantly altered the military balance in the Ohio Valley, leading to decisions that would reshape the region's future. On October 19, 1774, at Camp Charlotte, Chief Cornstalk accepted the terms of our reconciliation offered by Governor Dunmore. The treaty terms were clear and far-reaching. The Shawnee and their allies were required to return all captives and stolen property from their raids. They had to recognize the Ohio River as the boundary with Virginia, as established by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, and acknowledge all land cessions on the river's south bank. The Native Americans agreed not to hunt on Virginia's side of the Ohio, nor interfere with boats passing on the river. As a guarantee of good faith, 6 Shawnee chiefs or their sons would travel to Williamsburg as hostages. Dunmore reciprocated with promises of protection and fair treatment by his government and the people of Virginia. The agreement represented an armistice until permanent terms could be negotiated at Pittsburgh in the spring. However, history had other plans. By April 1775, before many Virginia militiamen had even returned home from Dunmore's war, the battles of Lexington and Concord erupted in Massachusetts. The American Revolution had begun, and Lord Dunmore, who had led the Virginia forces at Point Pleasant, would soon find himself leading British troops against the same militiamen who had fought under his command. The Battle of Point Pleasant's influence on American history proved far-reaching. It secured vast territories south of the Ohio River for colonial settlement, opening Kentucky and West Virginia for expansion. The victory bolstered colonial military confidence just months before the Revolution began. The experienced militia officers and troops who fought at Point Pleasant would soon form the backbone of Virginia's revolutionary forces. Today, the battle is commemorated during Battle Days, an annual festival in modern Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Some consider it the first battle of the American Revolution, though this remains a point of historical debate. In 1908, the United States Senate passed a bill to erect a monument commemorating the battle as a Battle of the Revolution, though the bill ultimately failed in the House. The sacrifices made at Point Pleasant by both colonials and Native Americans marked a pivotal moment in the struggle for the American frontier. From the banks of the Kanawha to the fields of Lexington and Concord, the spirit of resistance and determination shown by both sides would echo through the coming Revolutionary War. If you found this story of frontier conflict, strategic brilliance, and cultural collision fascinating, there are many more tales of Native American history waiting to be told. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories for weekly deep dives into the dramatic events that shaped early America. Ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss an update. History is always better when we explore it together.